In one of my videos, I received this comment. I'm really confused about you splitting Anglicans from Lutherans, giving the Porvoo Communion in Europe that fully joins all Apostolic Anglican and Lutheran churches in the continent. The teaching is the same. Edit. I checked your channel. You're American. That explains so much. Eye roll emoji. So I suppose the question is, are Lutheran and Anglican the same thing, or at least the same thing in Europe, if not America? So let's start with Europe, and particularly with the Porvoo Communion mentioned by the commenter. The Porvoo Communion is a group of church bodies that entered into a communion agreement, meaning that members in their churches can, for example, receive communion and pastoral care from the other churches in the communion, and ministers can transfer between the denominations without much difficulty. The Porvoo Communion is so named for the city that the signers of the agreement went to afterwards to celebrate joint communion, which took place in the Porvoo Cathedral. But it's worth noting that this cannot be fully considered a pan-European communion. Here's a Wikipedia editor's map of countries with Porvoo Communion member churches. Note that it's a tiny bit outdated, as the Lutheran Church in Great Britain is no longer an observer but a full member. As you can see, the communion contains churches in the British Isles, Northern Europe, and a couple in the Iberian Peninsula. Notably absent are any churches from places like Germany, the birthplace of Lutheranism, where 1/3 of European Lutherans live, or places where smaller numbers of Lutheran churches exist, like the Netherlands. While the Porvoo Communion can claim to represent a majority of Lutherans and Anglicans in Europe, they can't claim to represent those from a majority of countries. Another caveat to add is that even within the countries that the Porvoo Communion operates, there remain Lutheran and Anglican churches and denominations that are not part of it. To demonstrate, and since the commenter rightly pointed out that I am American, let's use American denominations to examine this point. In the United States, it must be said that there are three major Lutheran denominations. One is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the most liberal and ecumenical Lutheran denomination. The second is the conservative Lutheran denomination, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and the third is the even more conservative and confessional Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. The ELCA is part of an international communion of Lutheran churches, the Lutheran World Federation, which has 148 member church bodies, 77 million members in those churches, and church bodies from 99 countries. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod isn't part of the LWF. Rather, it is a founding member of the International Lutheran Council, which has 54 member church bodies, 7,150,000 members in those churches, and church bodies from 49 countries. The Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod is not part of either of those communions, but rather part of the Confessional Evangelical Lutheran Conference, of which it was a founding member. The CELC has 34 church bodies in 30 countries. The Porvoo Communion itself is part of the first group I mentioned, the Lutheran World Federation, which the ELCA is also a member of. So let's go back to the Porvoo map. In Norway, the Church of Norway is part of the Communion, but the Lutheran Church in Norway is part of the ILC, as is the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of Norway. These denominations are very small compared to the Church of Norway, but they are there, and they are Lutheran. Likewise, there is the Lutheran Confessional Church, which is part of the CELC, and there's also the Evangelical Lutheran Free Church, which is not part of the Porvoo Communion, but is part of the LWF. In Denmark, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Denmark is part of Porvoo, but the Evangelical Lutheran Free Church of Denmark is in the ILC. In Portugal, the Porvoo Communion has an Anglican church body, but the Portuguese Evangelical Lutheran Church is part of the ILC. Lutheran Church of Portugal is part of the CELC, and there's no Lutheran church body that is part of the Porvoo Communion or the Lutheran World Federation at all. It's worth noting, since we're talking about communion, that the member churches in the Lutheran World Federation, including the ELCA, practice open communion, where any baptized Christian can commune, whether Lutheran, Anglican, or something else. Some congregations don't even require you to be baptized. For the churches which are part of the ILC, some only allow members of other ILC churches to commune, and the CELC limits communion to other CELC church members. Another important point is that several church bodies are both in the LWF and the ILC at the same time. On the Anglican side of things, the 6 churches in the Porvoo Communion are also part of the Anglican Communion, which is to say, they are in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. But there do exist in the same geographic area denominations claiming Anglican apostolic succession that are not part of the Anglican Communion, for example, the Free Church of England. So what's the point of this discussion? The point is that even if the Porvoo Communion were to mean that there is no difference between Lutheran and Anglican churches within it, the Porvoo Communion communion is not all of Anglicanism or Lutheranism within the countries that it exists in. In most cases, if you live somewhere where there's a church that's part of the Porvoo Communion, you can also find either a Lutheran or Anglican church or both that's not part. So the claim that the Porvoo Communion fully joins all apostolic Anglican and Lutheran churches in the continent is untrue. And bringing it back to America, relevant to this discussion is the fact that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Episcopal Church signed a full communion agreement titled Called to Common Mission in 2000 that gives them basically the same level of fellowship that the Porvoo Communion churches have among themselves. So if the Porvoo Communion is all one, so also would be the ELCA and the Episcopal Church. Now, before we go on to discuss if churches in the Porvoo Communion are all the same thing, whether Lutheran or Anglican, let's take note that Anglicans and Lutherans not part of the communion are certainly different. As the commenter noted, this is explainable by one noticing the American scene, but as they missed, it's quite present in Europe too. So what are some of these differences? For example, most Lutherans have only 2 sacraments, while some Anglicans refer to 7, although the same 2, baptism and communion, are the only so-called sacraments of the gospel. Anglicans require apostolic succession in ordaining bishops, while most confessional Lutherans do not. Confessional Lutherans are often quite committed to a real presence view of communion called sacramental union, and Anglicans are often significantly more Big Ten on this issue, with some holding a higher and others a lower view than the Lutherans. There's enough difference between Lutherans and Anglicans that you can have a confessional Lutheran theologian make a video about why I am not Anglican. And if you're comparing a Lutheran denomination to an Anglican one, there are often differences that aren't necessarily tied to the denominational tag, but are differences nonetheless. ILC and CELC Lutherans don't allow women to be ordained, for example, and even 20% of Lutheran World Federation members don't either. On the side of the Anglican Communion, this is also controversial from a worldwide perspective, with almost everyone ordaining women as priests, but bishops being more divided, though in Europe all Anglican Communion churches ordain women. So now let's take on the much more specific claim. Are churches in the Porvoo Communion the same, whether Anglican or Lutheran? Let's look at the case for answering this with a yes. All of these churches are considered rather big tent, with room for clergy and members to believe differently on a lot of things. Since ministers can move between the denominations, there's a case to be made that any particular local congregation could easily slide into one or the other denomination in the communion if it weren't for the fact that they are in different geographical areas. The Lutheranism and Anglicanism of these denominations has broadened enough that there is wide overlap in their beliefs. For a video that talks more about how this happens, watch my video on theological liberal versus theological conservative. However, on the side of no, not only are there differences between the Lutherans and Anglican denominations in the communion, there are differences between the different denominations of the same tradition. In the British Isles, there are 4 Anglican denominations part of the Porvoo Communion: the Church of Ireland, Church in Wales, Scottish Episcopal Church, and the Church of England. In early 2023, the Church of England officially allowed the blessing of same-sex couples, but still doesn't allow same-sex marriages to be performed in the church. The Church of Ireland and Church in Wales also don't perform same-sex marriages. Meanwhile, the Scottish Episcopal Church has allowed same-sex marriage since 2017. Other differences include liturgical ones, such as the use of the Book of Common Prayer in the Anglican denominations, which is not used in the Lutheran ones. Within the Porvoo Common Statement, the document written for the communion, it is stated in recognition of there still being differences between the Lutheran and Anglican bodies. This summary witnesses to a high degree of unity in faith and doctrine. Whilst this does not require each tradition to accept every doctrinal formulation characteristic of our distinctive traditions, it does require us to face and overcome the remaining obstacles to still closer communion. Another part of the statement recognized a current difference when it stated, "We commit ourselves to work toward a common understanding of diaconal ministry." All in all, it must be said that though the Porvoo Communion has brought a greater level of consistency to Anglicanism and Lutheranism in Europe, it's inaccurate to say that it's gone so far as to make these 2 denominational families identical.